Katrina Shanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my pleasure to take a call in the Crimes Amendment Bill number 2 this evening. In fact, it's not my pleasure. I'm actually saddened and pretty sickened to take a call on this type of legislation. And it saddens and sickens me that we have to pass legislation to protect our children and our most vulnerable adults from abuse and neglect in New Zealand. And I don't know when we decided in New Zealand that it was any form of acceptability to abuse and neglect our vulnerable adults and children, but I know we do it, and we do it very well in New Zealand. So this is one of the solutions that this Parliament can take to protect our children and vulnerable adults from assault, neglect and ill treatment. And it is about this protection why we have got this legislation here today. And it's about holding people to account who do these terrible acts or turn a blind eye to these terrible acts every day in our society. This legislation, this bill, will provide greater accountability for the acts of violence and abuse and neglect for children and vulnerable adults. It will affirm that special status that children and vulnerable adults have under the criminal law and enforcing the current obligations that parents and caregivers have to protect them from harm. And it will recognise that other members of the community have responsibility as well for the well-being of children and vulnerable adults in certain limited circumstances. And I think it's important that when we talk about protecting our children and our vulnerable adults, it's not just about the immediate parents. It is about the community taking that responsibility. And I know in the second reading we talked about it takes a community to raise a family and to raise a child. And I think we all have to sit back and look what's happening in our own communities, in our neighbours, in our extended families, and take responsibility as well. This is about breaking the code of silence that exists in our communities. And it does include a new offence, which is failure to protect a child or vulnerable adult. For me, this is a no-brainer, and for many people tonight listening, this is exactly what we should be doing. As we watch innocent lives being wasted, and we're taking lives away from our youngest children, our most vulnerable in New Zealand, because we haven't had action before. And I do believe that this will turn some people around when they're sitting by watching it happening, and they will think actually that they can make a difference. We had a number of submissions in our select committee calling for tougher penalties against those who abuse and tighter controls on at-risk families. So it's about getting that balance right. The bill does increase the maximum penalty for breaching a duty from 7 years imprisonment to 10 years and doubles the penalty for the offence of ill treatment of a child from 5 years to 10 years. The government is also carrying out a number of programs aimed at improving the situation of at-risk families. Our Addressing the Drivers of Crime initiative is preventative to ensure that women, families and whānau are connected to the maternity and early parenting services they need and when they need them. Because we know that early intervention is so important to making a difference in people's lives. Another important aspect of this section of the legislation is the incorporation of vulnerable adults. And this was widened, and it was widened deliberately to ensure that those who are elderly, those who are disabled, those that cannot remove themselves from a situation are also covered. And I think it's terribly sad in New Zealand when we have to pass legislation to protect our elderly and protect our disabled from people abusing and neglecting them. Age Concern gave a fantastic submission to our committee in support of the extension of this bill to include vulnerable adults, and our committee discussed in depth the qualifiers for being considered vulnerable. This is typical in an area that New Zealand doesn't like talking about, but it is an issue that we must face, particularly as our population ages. The key test is the definition of a vulnerable adult relates to whether a person is able to withdraw him or herself from the care or charge of another person as a consequence of that person's age or any other cause. It's not a person's age, Mr Chair.
I call the Honourable Member Katrina Shanks.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It's not the person's age that results in them being vulnerable. However, it is that loss of independence of freedom that makes someone more vulnerable. As a whole, our committee worked hard to incorporate the suggestions of submitters during the select committee process, and we've come up with a bill that will go a long way to ensure that our most vulnerable are protected, and those that are responsible for abuse and neglect and watching abuse and neglect are also held accountable. We can't sit back and do nothing, and I believe this is a part of the solution to make a difference in New Zealand. Thank you, Mr Chair.
I call the Honourable Member Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you.